Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hemp Show here at Lancaster Farming. My name is Sophia Curzius and I'm filling in for Eric, who's away for a few weeks. We've got a special show for you today, and it's a bit of a departure from your average Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp podcast. Today's show is less about hemp and more about an interesting slice of history. And by that, I mean Lewis and Clark. Yep, those guys. But not just those guys, but also the plant samples that they collected on their way out west back in 1804. That collection is known as the Lewis and Clark Herbarium. It's housed in Philadelphia, where last year, Eric caught up with Rick McCourt, the botanist who oversees the collection. More after this break.
Today's show is brought to you with support from American Cast Hemp, America's premier hemp construction company. Do you want to learn how to build with hemp? Well, American has some training sessions coming up in May 7th through the 10th in Bally, Pennsylvania. This is where you learn how to mix the hemp and the lime, how to operate the lance, how to shoot the hemp at a wall, how to do all of the things. Plus, more than that, Cameron and the crew at American, they know that you're trying to start a business, and so they offer some really good best practices for bidding, for accounting, things like that. So you don't want to miss these training sessions. Go to american.com and find out more about the training. I will have that link on the show page for this episode. This episode is brought to you in part by IND Hemp in Fort Benton, Montana, where they believe in the goodness of hemp. Their mission is to provide innovative agricultural products and services to connect American farmers with the pioneers and businesses that see hemp as a way to bring real and lasting change to our communities and planet. Check them out at indhemp.com.
So yeah, Eric is still out. He should be back next week, but we'll see. In the meantime, while we wait, I thought we could listen to this interview that Eric conducted last May in Philadelphia at the Academy of Natural Sciences. It's not hemp-related at all, but fascinating nonetheless. At the Academy of Natural Sciences, Eric interviewed Rick McCourt, the head botanist and the guy who oversees the Lewis and Clark Herbarium, which is a collection of plants Lewis and Clark brought back from their journey of discovery across the American frontier. Lewis and Clark returned from their journey in 1806, but for the collection of plants, the journey continued for nearly 80 more years. Through a series of accidents, oversights, and just dumb luck, these 222 plant samples ended up on the other side of the Atlantic for many years, and were almost destroyed. It's a miracle that the collection exists at all, and today, Dr. Rick McCourt tells the tale.
So I'm here at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, and I am with Dr. Rick McCourt, the curator of botany. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Rick McCourt. I'm a curator of botany here at the Academy, and I'm also a professor in the Biodiversity, Earth, and Environmental Sciences Department at Drexel University. The Natural History Museum is part of Drexel as of 2012.
Okay, and I'm here today to talk to you specifically about Lewis and Clark's Herbarium. Can you just describe what that is?
Sure. We're on the 5th floor of the Academy building. On the 6th floor above us is a bunch of cabinets on compactor rails, which move around. They're kind of like libraries or art museums. And they allow you to stuff a bunch more compactor cabinets into one place. And there's 1.5 million specimens of plants up there. In the room we're standing in, which is much smaller, there's a smaller number of cabinets, probably about a dozen or so, and they have what are called our types and historical collections. The types are the specimens of plants that were looked at by authors who wrote and gave them a scientific name, so they wrote a paper about it. And so we keep the types of some of the ones here. We actually have a fairly large number. There's about 40,000, which is not much compared to 1.5 million, but compared to an herbarium this size, we have a lot because we're so old. Founded in 1812. So our historical collections are here too. They might not be used to describe a new species, but they were collected by people who long ago in some important expedition or place. Henry Muhlenberg is one of the collectors represented here. He's of the Muhlenberg family, which named Muhlenberg College and so forth, and the Lutheran Seminary. Also, Benjamin Smith Barton, who is a physician in Philadelphia at the turn of the 1800 century. And we have his collections and several other things. We have about 20 plants or so collected by Captain Cook's botanists on his cruises. For some reason, we got them, but that's not all of them, but that's some of them. So that's this room. And right here in these cabinets next to us they're a little bit different size, but they're specimens in special folders from the Lewis and Clark collection. So the herbarium or plant collection of Lewis and Clark was collected mostly by Lewis on his trip 1804 to 1806. And he brought them back here to Philadelphia in the condition where they were pressed flat and dried, which is how we preserve things. So we have them now. If you saw this, it would look like a bunch of flat boxes or shallow boxes in which the specimens of plants are located. And I'll show you one here just by pulling it out. This is a little bit more elaborate folder than we usually have for specimens of Lewis, of regular plants, pressed and so forth. We can keep them inside of archival paper that's acid-free, inside of manila folders, basically in cabinets, and they'll last for centuries that way. These would too, but in 2000 or thereabouts, we got a grant from Saving America's Treasures to rehouse the plants in special cabinets and also these little folders here, which you can see. It's recessed by about 1/2 inch, so nothing ever touches the top of the plant specimen. It's on about 11 by 17 piece of paper, which is an acid-free, high rag content cotton paper. And taped and glued to it is a specimen of a plant. And the one that you're looking at now is a tobacco plant that Meriwether Lewis got when he was in the vicinity of St. Louis in 1804. And it's still pretty leafy and dry. It doesn't have any color to it, really, but that bleaches out over the years. But it's basically intact, and you can still see the morphology or the shape of the plant and flowers. There's no fruits on this one, but the leaves are what's important in tobacco.
Was tobacco a wild plant at that point?
It did grow wild in the West, but this is probably cultivated by the Native Americans, as far as we know, because he got it from somebody who had been working with the Native Americans. I think it was a white guy, but he gave it to Lewis. And it's glued to the paper. We can actually tilt it upwards for display purposes, which you can't see on the radio, but you can see it here. And so in 2004 to 2006, we had this specially constructed so we could send these to places where they'd be protected from UV light in cabinets in cases of low light, and they could be displayed for a few weeks at a time. That doesn't happen very often. That was during the bicentennial of the expedition, 2004 to 2006. And since then, we've just kept them here. So they look exactly the same. There's a number of labels on it. In this case, there are a couple that were written by Meriwether Lewis himself. This one says the 12th of October near the Rickeras town. This is the tobacco which they cultivate. And so it's a cultivated tobacco grown by the Arikara tribe of Native Americans, which still exists today in the vicinity of, north of St. Louis in North Dakota area. And then there's a purple piece of paper here that also has Meriwether Lewis's writing on it. It says basically the same thing, specimen of Rickera's tobacco taken 12th of October, 1804. So that was the first fall of their expedition. Now, we don't have Lewis's handwriting on all the specimens. A lot of the little field tags he wrote with notes about them or where they were collected and what date it was, and sometimes what it was in a common name. A lot of those were discarded, but they were written up scientifically later by a different scientist, different botanist.
Okay, and so what's the size of the Lewis and Clark collection here?
We have 222 plants that were sure from Meriwether Lewis. There are 4 others that were associated with it in batches of collections over time. It's not exactly clear. It looks like they were probably collected by other people maybe a decade or 2 later. Okay. We keep them in the same cabinets, but they're probably collected by Thomas Nuttall or some other botanists. So 222 specimens. There are 10 left in England, which is part of the story of what happened.
Is that the entire collection, or how many specimens did they bring back?
That's the entire collection that made it back. They also sent back about 60 plants at the very first winter, shortly after this tobacco was collected, but they didn't send this back until later. or brought it back later. But in the spring of 1805, they sent back 60 plants, and the American Philosophical Society received them. That's the scientific society at the time. Still exists as a library and research institution here. But somehow they got misplaced. So we know they came back. We have labels and lists of them, but they were lost. But 222 came back with Lewis. He collected others, but he buried a few in caches, like underground kettle drums that were buried along the way, so with other kinds of equipment and stuff. Some of the caches, or two of them, were washed out or got moist anyway, and that's death to a dried plant, because then it just molds and falls apart. So probably there were maybe 100 or more plants, probably a couple of hundred plants that were lost. But maybe we're thinking, there's no list of them, but Lewis recollected them on the way back to some extent.
So it was President Jefferson who sent them on this mission, and it was many reasons. The main one was to find the Northwest Passage, or at least that's the myth, right?
Yeah, they wanted to find a water route to the west where they could take the Missouri River and maybe some other smaller rivers up to the mountains, which they expected to be as tall as the Appalachians, just because that's what they'd experienced out here in the East Coast. They were not, but then they expected to maybe be able to carry the canoes and goods over a small mountain range and then find a river that would go to the Pacific and establish a trade route. But of course, the Rocky Mountains got in the way, and they're much bigger than the Appalachians.
Wishful thinking on their part.
Yeah.
But some of the other reasons, like Jefferson was a farmer, and he was interested in new crops.
Yeah, Jefferson actually describes a species of, he thought it was actually a saber-toothed cat, but it turned out to be a ground sloth with a very long hooked toe that looked like a saber tooth. And he corresponded with scientists in France quite extensively. And he was a farmer, and he liked to experiment or try new species of plants. So the West was unexplored, and he thought this is a chance for Lewis, who was a military guy but had some botanical background, to go and bring back information in terms of the journals. He brought back several volumes of journals of notes, and also plant specimens. And Lewis didn't know how to press plants, as far as we know, because he never collected any before that. That was more of a scientific endeavor rather than a farming endeavor. So Jefferson sent him here to Philadelphia, which was the center of scientific learning at the time. And Benjamin Smith Barton, who I mentioned earlier, was a botanist and a physician who taught medicine and medicinal pharmacy, basically, at the University of Pennsylvania, which was a small medical school at the time. And he taught Lewis how to press and preserve plants, and he gave him parts of libraries or referred books to him so that he could take along the way. So Lewis could describe things with Latin terminology and scientific terms that Jefferson would understand, but also the rest of the scientific world would understand. And then if you bring back a specimen, you can always refer to it and then write it up later in a book.
Okay, talk a little bit more about the importance of Philadelphia at that time.
Yeah, Philadelphia was the biggest city in the country at the time. It was bigger than New York, and it was really the center for universities and medicine and politics. The White House was here up until 1800, or not the White House, but the president's residence was here until 1800. Jefferson went to Washington, D.C. for the first president there. But Jefferson, even though he's from Virginia, was affiliated with the American Philosophical Society, founded by Ben Franklin and cohorts. And this was a few years before the founding of the Academy of Natural Sciences, but there were still a lot of people here who knew about science. Caspar Wistar, the Wistar Institute now is a cancer research center named after him. Benjamin Rush, who was a physician and quite a well-known doctor of the time. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a youngster by relative terms then, so he was one of the last guys to sign the Declaration who lived. He lived here, and he gave Lewis advice about medicine, how to treat field injuries and diseases. And then Benjamin Smith Barton, who was both a botanist and a medical doctor, which was common in those days. So there were lots of people around he could learn from. And out in Lancaster, where you're from, a fellow named Ellicott taught him how to survey and use devices to determine latitude. And longitude, although that was more difficult in those days because they didn't have accurate clocks, which were necessary. So Lewis came here kind of like astronauts trained to go to the moon to learn how to collect rocks and things like that. Learned how to collect plants, and he collected hundreds of them. And we don't know that he ever collected plants later, but he only survived for 3 years after he came back. So he probably was kind of done with that. That was his military order to collect plants for Jefferson, and it was done.
And so Lewis and Clark's journey ended in September of 1806. Right. But these plants continue to take a journey.
Yeah,
Can you talk about what happened next?
Yeah, they came here, and most of the time, most of the plants stayed here in Philadelphia. They went to Washington, to Monticello, I think, and to the White House too. I'm still tracing that route out, but Jefferson saw them, and then he sent them up here to Benjamin Smith Barton, where he thought this botanist would kind of work them up and help Lewis pull together the notes for a natural history volume about the expedition. It would be published. It never was, to get to that part of the story. But the plants were kept and stored here. Barton kept them for a while, but he gave them to a fellow named Frederick Persch, a German botanist, who worked at a botanical conservatory near here. There was only one in the country at the time. But he knew a lot about plants, and so he helped Lewis by drawing pictures, making notes of them, and he could recognize them for scientifically what family they were in, and probably whether they were new species or not to science. So he gave the plants back to Lewis, or actually Lewis was gone, but he eventually transferred them back to Benjamin Smith Barton, and he left town. He had took with him, without telling too many people, about 57 plants, and he went to New York City for a couple of years and then on to London, where he was during the War of 1812. And he holed up there, and in a gentleman's herbarium there, this is a private collection of about 60,000 plants this fellow had named Lambert, and he wrote up the plants in a book form called Flora of North America, and that was published in England. It was in the middle of the War of 1812, so it's kind of interesting. Here this book comes out about North America. But so when Persch finished up, he left there, came back, and went to Canada, where he died later. Not too old, but he died in the 1820s. But he left behind the plants he had taken with him in Lambert's collection. So he still had them. They take care of these things in private collections pretty well. And so when Lambert died, though, in 1842, they auctioned off his house and also his collection of 60,000 plants. And a gentleman in the audience was Edward Tuckerman, who was a professor of history at Amherst College and also interested in botany. And he purchased a couple of boxes of North American plants that were in Lambert's collection. Kind of the end of the day, it was sort of the end dregs of the auction. And he found out they had the plants of Lewis and Clark in them, plus a bunch of other things. Of course, Lewis and Clark were not quite celebrities in the 1840s. That people knew about them, but it was not until later that they really became icons of exploration. But he brought them back here, and eventually, after about 10 years, he sent them to the academy from Amherst College, where he worked. And he said, "Why don't you keep these? You can do a good job of storing them for science, and I'll come and visit and look at the lichen collection." He was really well known as a lichenologist. Those are small little, they're plant-like things. They're fungi that have algae inside them, so they're green. They grow on trees and all over rocks.
Reindeer food, right?
Reindeer food, yeah, that's right. So Tuckerman was famous for that. He has a ravine named for him in Ithaca around Cornell called Tuckerman Ravine, and everybody knows about him. But his plants then came here. Meanwhile, at the American Philosophical Society, Barton, who died 1815, had given all his stuff to the APS, as we call it, American Philosophical Society, including his plant collection, which had the 170 specimens of Lewis and Clark. And they just sat in a storage area there, probably in a cabinet or a cupboard upstairs in a building that's no longer existent. But in the 1890s, a fellow who was a botanist and horticulturist in town named Thomas Meehan got his tip that these plants of Lewis and Clark might be there. So he went over and found them, brought them back to the academy, which at that time was in the building we're standing in. We moved a few times, but by the 1890s we were here in Logan Circle. And so that meant the 179 plants plus the 46 plants that Tuckerman brought back were together again, so they've been here ever since. At that auction Tuckerman was at, 10 of the plants of Lewis and Clark were somewhere else, probably being shared or in a different box, and so they ended up in a different place. However, they've been located, and they're now at the Kew Botanical Gardens in London, and so we know about them. And there could be others over there too, but if there are, it's not certain, because they probably would have been written about by Persch, and we pretty much accounted for everything he looked at.
The Brits are kind of weird with returning antiquities, though, aren't they?
Well, apparently so, especially like the Elgin marbles and things. So yeah, that counts as being their plants. So I doubt if they'd return them. Maybe they'll loan them to us someday for an exhibit, though. That'd be nice. We're in very friendly terms with them, though.
A special relationship.
Yeah.
Do you know how much the guy in England paid for them at auction?
It was just a few shillings. He said he kind of purchased it on a whim. I looked it up, and it would be a few $100s in today's money, although I don't know if you really can translate something in 1840 to now and say what really it's worth. But he had enough money that he could spend some money on it, but it was not like an exorbitant treasure, no.
So is this collection open to the public, or how can the people experience?
Well, because we can potentially damage them every time we handle them, and if we expose them to light, as we're doing now, over time that does degrade them a bit. So we try not to love them to death because there'd be too much interest in it. But on special occasions, we'll put out some for exhibit and UV ultraviolet light protected cabinets and things like that. So occasionally we do bring them out. Yeah.
How did you get involved in this, and did you have a mentor that brought you into this?
Yeah, well, I got a job as a curator of botany here. I actually study algae and seaweeds and things like that, but I liked historical items when I came in here. And so Ernie Schuyler was a curator here. He's a retired curator now. He really knew a lot about this, and he's one of the world's experts on it. He's retired now, not here, but he taught me about it, and I started looking in archives and just digging into the records and the journals and things to find out more. So Ernie taught me a lot. And a colleague of mine who's about my age, Earl Spalmer, worked at the American Philosophical Society, but at the time he was at the Academy. And he and I were very big into the history of this place because we have a lot of old fossils owned by Thomas Jefferson, Charles Wilson Peale, and other people. And William Clark collected some. And so he and I kind of got into the history part of this, and we dug deeper that way. So those two people are the main ones. Strangely enough, I went to school at Lewis and Clark College, but I had no idea I'd be working on anything they did.
So I saw you give a sort of a talk at the Union League a few weeks ago, and I remember a story about like a wild tobacco, a Nicotiana, that was found maybe in Montana. Can you sort of set that up and tell that story?
Yeah, well, people asked if anything has gone extinct that they collected, and the answer up until now was no, except there's a variety of tobacco, this one we're looking at on the table here, that was extinct in the wild. And so nobody had really seen it. But in about 2013, I think it was, a fellow named Jim Reveal, who is also an expert who taught me a lot, but he passed away a few years ago, was exploring in the West because he was a real expert on Western flowers, especially wildflowers, but anything that had to do with botany. And he went to a place called Fort Union, which is a National Historic Site in North Dakota. And in a garden there, he noticed a plant, and it was it looked like and was the tobacco variety that was supposed to be extinct. So I'm sure he did a double take when he came by it, because he would be one of the few people who would recognize it. And he asked about where the seeds came from, because it was growing in a garden at the historic site. And the fellow said, well, we got seeds from a Native American colleague of ours. And so I've been asking around to people, Native American colleagues and contacts I have in that area. Most of them are a little bit older now, so they're retired, and nobody knows for sure who had the seeds, but they might have been kept by Native Americans and cultivated over the decades and centuries, which is something that Native Americans do with seeds that they care about for ceremonial or medicinal purposes. They don't necessarily share them with outsiders of any kind. And so maybe that these seeds were just kept and passed on from one generation to the next, we don't know. But we have a specimen of that living plant from 2013 that we are going to do some genetic work on, and maybe someday we'll sacrifice a tiny blade of this specimen here and get the DNA out of it to see whether it's related to that Indian tobacco that was found in 2013. It wouldn't be as unlikely that it's exactly the same, but it's definitely the same variety and species. And the ethnobotanists have a lot more knowledge about this, and so we can maybe fit into that picture sometime.
Okay. What was the man's name who saw the plant?
James Reveal. He was a professor at University of Maryland.
Can you tell me some more about him?
Yeah, he was. He studied plants of the West. He was a systematist. That means he could identify plants, and he revised species and genera and sort of gave it the taxonomy of different plants. But he really got into the history of botany in America, and so he wrote a number of books for the Smithsonian, and he has a book called Lewis and Clark's Green World, which is about the Lewis and Clark plants. And it's pictures of the plants as they exist now in nature. And there's a lot of footnotes and historical material in there that are about the collection itself. So he would come here and visit, and he and Ernie and Gary Moulton, who edited the latest edition of the journals, wrote a slim volume of about 50, 60 pages, sort of with the exact, or to the best of our knowledge, exactly which scientific names apply to all the different specimens and how that fits into the larger scientific world. So that publication is available from the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences. Probably it's online and some other places.
Can you tell me a bit about the other work that you're doing now, projects, research? I'm actually working on a book about this because there's a lot of stories to tell related to this, Earl Spalmer and I, and we're working with an artist. A coffee table book of a bunch of dead plants is not really going to sell that well, but certain aspects of them are interesting and quite fascinating, including the labels of some of the specimens. So I'm working on that and some other historical botany types of things. My research itself is about molecular systematics and evolution of green algae, and what the nearest relatives are sort of the evolutionary cousins of the land plants we see all around us that are so important to our existence. Where'd they come from? Because they were not always on land. Prior to about 500 million years ago, land was not populated by more than just bacteria, some fungi, and some insects and things like that. So plants came out of freshwater swamps probably and evolved into all the flora we see around us today. So I'm looking at sort of the ancient relatives of those guys. That's really fascinating. That's cool.
And you can look at it, you can decipher that using the DNA. Nowadays we have some methods to reconstruct that. Yeah.
Okay. And you can extract the DNA from these plant samples from Lewis and Clark?
You probably can. We've done it with other plant specimens from that vintage of the 1800s. Drying plants out turns out to be a pretty good way to preserve the DNA. It's long strings of components called nucleotides, but they're chemicals of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, just like anything else in a plant. And when you dry them out and press them so that they don't disintegrate and degrade in the refrigerator where you put them or whatever, once they're stable that way, the DNA in the leaves and stems or fruits stays fairly stable and doesn't really change. It can fragment, but sometimes you can put them together like a jigsaw puzzle if you get the sequences of it. So the DNA and some other things like carbon and oxygen isotopes can also be extracted from dead plant material. And what's in the plant now is what was in the plant when they lived. And so they actually absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the carbon isotopes can tell you what CO2 concentration was in the air where they lived. So you can actually do some biochemistry with these plants. And since we and other places have hundreds of years of specimens to examine, that might be something that we see more of in the future.
It's going to keep future students busy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Do you have a working title of your book and a possible, publish date?
No, I don't. I'm hoping to finish it in the next year or so because I'm retiring from teaching in the fall. We've toyed around with the idea of calling it Meriwether's Plants or something like that. But it was actually I was thinking of doing a podcast called Meriwether's Plant Collection, a podcast in 222 acts. That is 220 acts of collection.
I love that idea. Can I get involved in that? Can I help you with that?
Oh, maybe we could. Yeah.
That's super cool. That's a great idea.
So, we're looking for a publisher, so it's kind of in the preliminary stages, but we've written about a third to half of the book already. We published some other articles too that are historical and they're in the scientific literature, but they're actually kind of entertaining to read about the history as well.
Awesome. Dr. Rick McCourt, thank you so much for your time here today. This is great. I wonder once we stop recording if you'll show me some more plants, I can take some pictures.
Sure, that'd be fine.
All right. Well, good luck with your book and congratulations on retirement.
Thank you. Great.
All right, there you go. Dr. Rick McCourt from the Academy of Natural Sciences, part of Drexel University in Philadelphia. We've got a ton of photos from Eric's trip to see the herbarium on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. And while you're there, sign up for the hemp newsletter. If you've got any questions or concerns, send an email to podcast@lancasterfarming.com. All right, thanks for listening. My name is Sophia, filling in for Eric Herlock. Until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
This episode of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2025 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show is written and recorded, edited and produced by Eric Herlock and Sophia Curzius. The music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.